Hello everybody. As Rachel said, I'm Rhona Brown from the Centre for Robert Burns Studies and the Scottish Literature Department at Glasgow. So let me just get my slides up and we can get going. So I shall remember the unfortunate Mary, Robert Burns and Mary Queen of Scots. I'm going to talk a wee bit about the 18th century representation of Mary that Burns inherits, and then I'm going to spend some time talking about how Burns talks about Mary and how he represents her in a different way from what's been done before. So in the 18th century, Mary Queen of Scots was in many ways a contested and controversial figure with a contested and controversial legacy. At the same time, though, the 18th century sees a shift away from, in some ways, the stark polarity of the previous century in seeing Mary as either diabolically bad or as saintly good, and towards attempting a more balanced portrait of her life and reign. Although schisms in Mary's reception still definitely exist in the 18th century, the context and legacy of Scottish Enlightenment writings on, among lots of other things, the moral sense, empathy, sympathy, alongside the rise of the literature of sensibility and the germination of Romanticism, means that a different kind of feeling now enters debates on Mary's life and eventual fate. And in this, Robert Burns's representations of the unfortunate Mary are central. So before we come to Burns's view of Mary, it's useful, I think, to see how she was represented throughout the 18th century. She's always a figure of interest, and she's never far away from 18th century scholarship and debate and literature. As the century wears on, new scholarly work is done by Walter Goodall on the controversial casket sonnets, which some of you will know about, which were used as evidence of Mary's guilt in her trial, but which to this day have never definitively been proven to having been written by her. Alongside Goodall's linguistic analysis, 18th century scholars search for manuscript sources, which they don't often find. They print Mary's poems and letters in literary magazines. And towards the end of the century, she becomes a subject of fiction and poetry herself, with new novels, plays, and poems written on her life. And finally, as the 19th century dawns, she becomes almost a subject for women's moral reflection. But I'd like to begin with some 18th century scene setting to show the idea of Mary that Burns inherited when he was writing in the 1780s and 90s. This quotation from a review of Samuel Jebb's History of the Life and Reign of Mary Queen of Scots, I think gives quite a good idea of how Mary was seen at the beginning of the 18th century. This reviewer says, "The several writers who have undertaken to give us the history of Mary Queen of Scots have been either so extravagant in her praises as to allow no human errors to have fallen to her share, or have heaped on her such a load of infamy as to make her appear a very monster in wickedness." So begins this reviewer's response to Mary's life, but also to the 16th century, we could argue, which is deemed irrational by the violence of religious devotion or religious revolution. The reviewer continues, "The Reformation had then divided the world into parties, and as that princess was serious in the cause of the Romish religion, 'twas looked upon as the distinguishing mark of a good Protestant to tarnish her character and blacken her reputation. On the other hand, the Roman Catholics, respecting her as a martyr of the Church of Rome, have swelled their panegyrics while they have represented her as a perfect pattern of purity and virtue without any blemish." Now, it would be untrue to say that polarised responses don't continue in the 18th century, because they definitely do, and they were probably in reality motivated or at least informed by religious attachments. But Mary's 16th century context allows this commentator to look back on her unruly time with the rational, he would see it, more civilised mind of the 18th century thinker. And in keeping with Enlightenment ideals of progress, history as an ever-evolving trajectory, this commentator looks back at Mary's unlucky context with a knowing and arguably quite patronising eye. And indeed, some 18th century commentators say, "Oh, we wish Mary had been born in the 18th century, where she would have been treated with less savagery and with a lot more kindness." Whether that's true, whether that would be true in reality, of course, is open to debate. One surprise discovery I made when I was surveying 18th century responses to Mary in the popular press is that she had a kind of unlikely but nevertheless tireless supporter throughout the century well before Burns, and it was Tobias Smollett, who some of you might know, novelist, historian, journalist, magazine editor, physician, author of Humphrey Clinker is his most well-known novel, and noted political unionist. And he's quite consistent in what he sees as his rational support for and rational support for Mary in the face of what he sees as partiality. And this we might not anticipate if we expect support for and opposition to Mary to fall along religious political lines. But a good example of Smollett's attitude comes in his review of Maitland's History and Antiquities of Scotland, and this is in the Critical Review of April 1757. He says, Mary's enemies and calumniators were a set of gloomy, rancorous, hypocritical religionists, blind to every attraction of elegance, dead to the sentiment of honour and generosity. In a word, the Scots were so degenerate in this period that there does not seem to have been a wise or an honest man in the whole kingdom. So in his defence of Mary, Smollett demonstrates his belief that she was in an impossible position as queen, which most of us would probably agree with, but at the same time he brings back exactly those black and white religious polarities that other commentators criticise. And indeed, in the Critical Review of June 1757, in a review of Smollett's Complete History of England, the reviewer states that the catastrophe of the beauteous Mary Queen of Scots is an affecting proof of the author's talent for the pathetic, which the humane reader will not peruse without emotion. So according to that reviewer, Smollett's Mary becomes an object of pathos, the perfect theme for an author of sensibility, which emphasised tearful responses to so-called pathetic situations and pathetic people. Obviously pathetic from pathos, they are not in the way that we would use it today. So for Smollett, the textual and linguistic evidence exonerates Mary, but so too does the humane and sympathetic response to her life and fate. And as we'll see, Burns follows him in this regard. By the mid-18th century, another Marian fixation emerges, and it's an obsessive preoccupation with the details of Mary's execution and death, and really quite minute details. The Gentleman's Magazine for September 1759, published when Burns was but 2 months old, emphasises details which other publications will dwell upon: the tears of Mary's courtiers, her quiet patience in death, her faithfulness to her Catholicism despite attempts to convert her, and the fact that they all report on this, the fact that when she was beheaded, she was shown to be wearing a red wig over her grey hair. And the account ends as follows, in a theme that will be picked up very strongly by Burns. Thus died Mary, and thus lived Elizabeth. Over that part of Mary's character which virtue cannot approve, humanity will ever draw the veil of compassion and incline every tender and generous mind to impute her faults rather to her situation than disposition. But the conduct of Elizabeth is such as cannot fail to excite a degree of abhorrence and indignation, which we know not how to think any misfortunes would soften into pity. Her dissimulation was not extorted by present distress or inextricable difficulty, but practised to gratify the wanton wishes of ambition and resentment. And her cruelty was not prompted by intolerable justices or sudden and impetuous passion, but was the deliberate and voluntary tribute of cunning to interest. So in place of partisan views of Mary's frailties, this commentator unites all feeling minds behind Mary and in stark opposition to Elizabeth. And as we'll see here, certainly, Mary is a victim of malice, she's a victim of circumstance, of jealousy, and as we'll see, Burns also has some choice words for Mary, for Elizabeth I and her treatment of Mary. The next 18th century representation I'd like to look at brings us much closer to Burns. In 1760, William Tytler's, very long title, they liked a long title in the 18th century, William Tytler's Historical and Critical Inquiry into the Evidence Produced by the Earls of Moray and Morton against Mary Queen of Scots is reviewed in the Monthly Review that July. The reviewer is relieved again that civilization has progressed since Mary's time, with a comment that says as much really about the reviewer's own 18th century context as it does about the 16th century. And this is where the Jacobitism interest comes in. We believe the time when a man who would not believe Mary a monster without evidence ran the risk of being stigmatised as a Jacobite. Thank heaven these narrow prejudices begin to subside, and as the principles of the review are so well established, we shall deliver our sentiments of the article before us without disguise. So here the reviewer admits that following the Jacobite risings of the first half of the 18th century, Mary becomes an icon of the Stuart cause, thereby polarising public opinion yet again. A mere 14 years after the devastation of Culloden, these stigmas are in the wane, according to this commentator, and thanks to the period's self-professed rationality, it's now apparently safe to defend Mary without being branded a Jacobite. How true this was in reality is very much open to debate, but again, Mary has become here a symbol through which commentators can parade their rationality and their sympathy. So William Tytler of Woodhouse-Lee, he's born in 1711, dies in 1793, is the author of a particularly warm and sympathetic representation of Mary, and he and his text were known to Burns. Tytler was a writer to the Signet who assisted James Johnson in the early volumes of the Scots Musical Museum, a collection of Scottish song to which Burns contributed a number of songs, which he had either collected, edited, or written himself. Tytler assisted Burns in the collection of songs for later volumes of the Scots Musical Museum too, and despite what our recently quoted commentator says, Tytler was very well known to have Jacobite sympathies. And this is shown primarily really through his defence and preservation of Scottish music and song, as well as supporting Johnson's endeavours in the Scots Musical Museum. Tytler also encouraged song editor George Thomson, whose collections would also feature Burns's contributions in the 1790s and after Burns's death. Tytler's defence of Mary was written in response to what he saw as attacks on her memory by his Enlightenment contemporaries, particularly William Robertson and David Hume. Burns, well aware of these political connections, becomes quite close to Tytler during his first visit to Edinburgh in 1787 and immediately begins collaborating with him in their shared passion for Scottish song. In a letter to Tytler of the 4th of May 1787, Burns thanks his new friend in grateful remembrance of the many civilities you have honoured me with since I came to Edinburgh. And in a letter of August 1787, Burns states that the enclosed songs that he sends to Tytler will flatter Tytler's true old-style Caledonian feelings. So Tytler's associated with Old Caledonia, which is, I think, quite significant. More than this, however, Burns's epistle to Mr. Tytler of Woodhouse-Lee, author of A Defence of Mary Queen of Scots, written in May 1787, makes the poet's feelings on Tytler and by extension Mary really quite crystal clear. These are a couple of stanzas. The one on the left is the first stanza, which I'll read, obviously addressed to Tytler. Revered defender of beauteous Stuart, a name once respected, a name which to love was the mark of a true heart, but now 'tis despised and neglected. So immediately Burns presents his Jacobite credentials here, I think you'll see. Tytler is praised for his defence of Mary, here named beauteous Stuart, and for his respect for the Stuart name, which is unfairly despised and neglected. So it's quite clear whose side Burns is on. Jacobitism, through the examples of Tytler and Mary, is seen to be the mark of a true heart. Though he states that still in prayers to King George I must cordially join, thus showing public support for the Hanoverian monarch then on the British throne, Burns dismisses their lofty position in the second quotation here. But why of that epocha make such a fuss that brought us the electoral stem? If bring them over was lucky for us, I'm sure 'twas lucky for them. So Burns is referring here to the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688, when Scotland's Stuart monarch, James VII, was deposed and replaced by Mary and William of Orange. Burns doubts here that it was lucky for the Scots, but he certainly does not doubt that it was a lucky turn of events for William and Mary, who came to the throne through a kind of unconventional route, shall we say. In the poem, Burns treads a line between weak public approval of the Hanoverian monarchy and private but sincere support for the Stuarts. Indeed, Burns's language shifts towards Catholicism at the end of the poem. He states that he has enclosed an engraving of himself, a trifle ahead of a bard, which is sent as a mark of regard, sincere as a saint's dying prayer. Reminiscent of the final moments of Mary's life, Burns's poem contributes, albeit in quite a gentle way, to the representation of Mary as a martyr to the Catholic religion. Burns ends with an acknowledgement that Tytler's years are advancing. Now life's chilly evening dims shades on your eye and ushers the long dreary night. Sorry, I've gone on to the wrong slide. He ends with the sure conclusion that Tytler's aim is true, but you, like the star that athwart gilts the sky, your course to the latest is bright. So in this really quite cordial poem, Burns demonstrates not only his affection for Tytler, but his approval of Tytler's project. Burns warmly admires Tytler's defence of beauteous Stuart, and we could say the Jacobite cause more generally. In his correspondence, Burns is also engaged in remembering Mary, particularly with female correspondence. In a letter to Lady Winifred Maxwell Constable of the 25th of April 1791, Burns thanks his correspondent for a gift of what Burns's first biographer James Curry describes as a valuable snuff box with a fine picture of Mary Queen of Scots on the lid. Here Burns adopts the language of Catholicism when writing his thanks. I assure your ladyship I shall set it apart. The symbols of religion shall only be more sacred. In the moment of poetic composition, the box shall be my inspiring genius. When I would interest my fancy in the distresses incident to humanity, I shall remember the unfortunate Mary. Burns encloses a song for Mary, which I'll discuss very shortly, written to, as he puts it, the memory of our greatly injured, lovely Scottish Queen. A year earlier, when Burns wrote his song for Mary, he sent a copy of the song to Mrs. Graham of Fintry on the 10th of June 1790, stating that the story of Mary Queen of Scots has a peculiar effect on the feelings of the poet. The song in question, the song that he sent to both Constable and to Fintry, is the very memorable lament of Mary Queen of Scots on the approach of spring, which I'd like to spend the rest of my time with you talking about. Because really nowhere is Burns's affection for and sad remembrance of Mary more apparent than here. In this piece, Burns speaks in Mary's voice and takes a very human approach to representing Mary's mindset as she awaits execution and observes the first shoots of spring. I'll read the whole poem and then we'll come back to the details later. I hope I can do this without the tear coming to my own eye, because it is quite a tough one, this. Now nature hangs her mantle green on every blooming tree, and spreads her sheets o' daisies white out o'er the grassy lea. Now Phoebus cheers the crystal streams, and glads the azure skies, but nocht can glad the weary wight that fast endurance lies. Now lavrocks wake the merry morn aloft on dewy wing, the merrill in his noontide bower makes woodland echoes ring, the mavis wild wi' mony a note sings drowsy day to rest, in love and freedom they rejoice wi' care nor thrall oppressed. Now blooms the lily by the bank, the primrose down the brae, the hawthorn's budding in the glen, and milk white is the sleigh. The meanest hind in fair Scotland may rove their sweets amang, but I, the Queen of all Scotland, maun lie in prison strang. I was the Queen of bonny France, where happy I hae been. Full lichtly raise I in the morn as blithe lay down at e'en, and I'm the sovereign of Scotland, and mony a traitor there, yet here I lie in foreign bands and never-ending care. But as for thee, thou false woman, my sister and my fay, grim vengeance yet shall whet a sword that through thy soul shall gae. The weeping blood in woman's breast was never known to thee, nor the balm that draps on wounds of woe frae woman's pitying ee. my son, may kinder stars upon thy fortune shine, and may those pleasures gild thy reign that ne'er would blink on mine. God keep frae thee thy mother's face, or turn their hearts to thee, and where thou meet'st thy mother's friend, remember him for me. O soon to me may summer suns nae mair light up the morn, nae mair to me the autumn winds wave o'er the yellow corn, and in the narrow house of death let winter round me rave, and the next flowers that deck the spring bloom on my peaceful grave. So Burns is really one of the earliest to represent Mary's own voice, and his purpose is to depict Mary's thought processes as she moves towards her execution date. The poem begins with a skillful, typically Burnsian skillful representation of nature, with its romanticised but quite precise portrayal of springtime. Here the trees are in bloom, the sun is shining, the sky is brilliant blue. In response, the lark sing, the blackbird or the merle sings in the woodland, while the song thrush, the mavis, shouts its money notes. All are joined in rejoicing in love and freedom. The lily and the primrose have begun to bloom, while the blossom of the sloe is milk white. I think that's a lovely description. Milk white is the sleigh. All this love, freedom, growth and rejuvenation stands in stark contrast to Mary herself, who despite being Queen of all Scotland must lie in prison strang. It's here that Burns represents many of the concerns regarding Mary shared by his fellow 18th century commentators. Like Tytler and Smollett, he represents Mary as a wronged monarch who should have been treated with greater kindness. Echoing the writings of Enlightenment scholars such as Adam Smith and Francis Hutcheson, who argued that human beings have an innate moral sense which makes them naturally interested in the emotions of others and allows us to have sympathy for our fellow human beings. Burns portrays Mary looking back to happy days in bonny France before moving to Scotland, a place of traitors who allowed her to be imprisoned in foreign bands, as he puts it. When Mary moves from her own situation to those of others, she removes from pathos to quite unveiled anger, and the main target of her rage, of course, is Elizabeth. In Burns's representation, Elizabeth is a stranger to the weeping blood in woman's breast, the balm that drops on wounds of woe, woman's pitying ee. She lacks Mary's feminine empathy. She is a false woman, and she's a foe for whom Mary wishes a bloody revenge. In this, Burns echoes previous commentators who stated that while we might have some sympathy for Mary's fate, the same can't quite be said of Elizabeth. And the tone becomes mournful when Mary says farewell to her son, the future King James VI of Scotland, for whom she wishes kinder stars to shine upon his life and reign. She prays for James's protection from her own foes. We know, and Burns knew, that James would accomplish one of Mary's reported objectives. He became King of both Scotland and England, something Mary had a claim to but never fulfilled, but in doing so united the two kingdoms in the union of the crowns of 1603. The final stanza shows Mary ruminating on nature's seasons as a reflection on the seasons of life, bemoaning that she will never again see summer suns or feel autumn winds. But at the same time in death, she's protected. In the narrow house of death, let winter round me rave. The next flowers that deck the spring bloom on my peaceful grave. So in death, Mary has peace. She's finally protected from the ravages of the world's winters and from her foes. So thank you for joining me for this really short whistle-stop tour around 18th century representations of Mary and a consideration of Burns's depiction of her life, her reign, her imprisonment, and by extension, the Stuart cause. Burns brings, I think, something special to the representation of Mary by giving her a voice, her own voice, by giving her emotions, and by making her an authentic human being who was wronged by her phase, as he saw it. Thank you very much.